Today we're going deep into the most terrifying figures in all of Tolkien. The Nazgûl. The Ringwraiths. The Nine. Not the surface version where they're just scary horsemen in black robes, but the full horrifying reality of what these beings actually are, who they were before the darkness took them, exactly how that darkness worked, and what was left of the people they used to be. Because the more you understand about the Nazgûl, the worse they get. There is a road through the Shire at dusk, and on that road is a sound. Not a voice, not a clear sound of any specific thing. A presence first. The kind of presence that makes the birds stop calling, that makes horses shy and pull at their leads, that makes the ordinary comfortable warmth of an evening feel suddenly thin and precarious. And then the sound itself, which Tolkien describes as a cry that is like the call of some vast bird of prey, but wrong. Fundamentally wrong, containing something that bypasses the ears and goes straight to somewhere deeper, some part of the mind that has no name, that is very old, that has been saying the same thing since before humanity had language to put it in. Run. Not from this specific thing. Just run. 3 hobbits are pressed into the roots of a tree in the dark. Sam is barely breathing. Frodo's hand is on the ring in his pocket, the pull of it stronger than it has ever been, as if the ring is reaching toward whatever is on that road, the way a compass needle reaches north. And the dark shape on the dark horse pauses. It is smelling the air. It knows something is here that should not be here. Something that carries the specific scent of the thing it has been searching for across the length and breadth of the Shire. That dark shape was once a man. This is the fact that the story gives you, and that most readers walk past without fully sitting with. Not a demon, not a creature that was always this, not something born to darkness. A man, a real man with a name and a history and people who knew him, with desires and fears and hopes that were recognizably human. A man who accepted a gift and became this. A man who is still, in whatever attenuated and terrible form, present somewhere inside the shadow thing that is making the birds silent on the evening road. Today we're going to go into that story completely. Who these 9 men were. What the rings actually did to them. What the process of becoming a ringwraith looked and felt like from the inside. What remains of a person when they've been stretched across 2,000 years of wraith existence. And what the Nazgûl reveal about Tolkien's deepest understanding of what evil actually does to a self. The 9 who were great. Tolkien gives us tantalizing fragments about the identity of the 9 ringwraiths. He never names all of them. He is more interested in what they became than who they were. Because the story he is telling is about the transformation, not the original material. But what he does tell us is enough to construct a picture of why these 9 specifically were chosen. Why Sauron offered his 9 most dangerous gifts to these 9 people. They were kings and sorcerers and great lords of men. This is not just background color. In the Second Age, when the 9 rings for mortal men were given, this meant something specific and significant. The Second Age was the height of Menrian civilization. The closest that mortal men ever came to the kind of power and achievement that Tolkien elsewhere associates with the Elvish realms. The Menrian culture at its peak had lifespans that reached to 400 years, had wisdom and craft and knowledge that went back to direct Elvish teaching, had the specific quality of civilizational achievement that Tolkien most respects, not simple military power but deep knowledge, the kind that comes from taking the study of the world seriously over long generations. 3 of the 9 were great Menrian lords. The Witch King, their leader and Sauron's greatest servant, was probably the mightiest of these, a king of men whose specific origin Tolkien left deliberately vague but whose power in life must have been exceptional, because the process of ring corruption produces a wraith whose strength reflects the strength of the original bearer. The Witch King of Angmar, who holds kingdoms in terror across 8 centuries, who the greatest warriors of Gondor and Arnor fear to face, who drives Denethor to despair through a palantir, was made from someone already extraordinary. There is also Carmel the Black Easterling, the only ringwraith Tolkien names beyond the Witch King. He was a lord of the Eastern Men, the peoples of Ren, who became Sauron's second in command among the Nine, and is specifically noted as being particularly potent in darkness, his perceptions sharper, his presence more oppressive, in night than in day. The specific quality Tolkien gives Carmel tells us something about the original person. This was someone whose nature, even before the ring, was oriented toward the particular qualities the ring brought out most intensely. Not necessarily evil in his original form, but dark in some way, drawn to power that operated in the unseen spaces, in the margins, in the night. The others Tolkien does not name or describe in detail. What he gives us is their collective description: kings, sorcerers, warriors, great men of their era. Not a random sample of ambitious people, a curated group, selected by the most intelligent malice in the world for the specific quality of their susceptibility, combined with the specific quality of their power. You need to be powerful enough that the ring's corruption produces something genuinely formidable. You need to be susceptible enough that the corruption actually takes. Sauron was offering rings, not imposing them. This is critical to understanding the Nazgûl's tragedy. He came as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and he made arguments and promises that were compelling to people who were already great and who wanted to remain great, who wanted their civilizations to endure, who wanted to push back against the ordinary processes of time and loss that even the most powerful mortal existence is subject to. The rings were accepted freely, in the beginning, by people who had reasons for accepting them. Tolkien is explicit in his letters that this is part of the horror. The Nine Ringwraiths were not coerced. They were not tricked in any simple sense. They were offered something real by a being who genuinely had the power to deliver it, and they said yes. The thing they were offered was genuine. The price they paid was not disclosed in full, the gift and its promise. To understand what the rings actually offered, you need to understand what the great men of the Second Age most feared and most wanted. They were mortal. This is the specific and defining condition of men in Tolkien's world. Not mortality as a theological problem, not a metaphysical question about the nature of the soul, but the lived experience of being in a world that is largely built by and for beings who do not die. The elves don't age. The Valar are deathless. Even the dwarves live 3 times as long as men. And the most gifted and ambitious men of the Second Age, the ones building the great Memorian civilization and extending it into Middle-earth, these people were aware, every day, that the time they had was less than the time required to fully accomplish what they were trying to accomplish. This is not a small thing. Imagine building a civilization and knowing that you personally have perhaps 100, 150 years, if you are blessed, to contribute to it. Imagine having the specific kind of genius and drive that actually makes significant contributions to civilizational work, and knowing that the work will outlast you and be continued by people who will not have been there for its founding, who will not carry the specific understanding that only the founding moment can give. Imagine the frustration of seeing the next step clearly and knowing you will not personally live to take it. The rings offered more time. Not the elvish kind of immortality. Sauron's gifts were always a version of what was being sought, not the genuine thing. But extension. Years becoming decades, becoming centuries. The kind of extended life that would let a great ruler actually see the long-term consequences of their decisions. The kind of extended life that would let a great scholar actually finish their work. The kind of extended life that would let a great warrior actually complete what they had started. Beyond time, the rings offered enhanced capability in the present. Greater perceptual acuity. Stronger will. The ability to project authority and command in ways that made other people instinctively deferential. These were real effects. They happened. The 9 men who wore the rings did not merely feel themselves to be more powerful. They were more powerful, in ways that were observable to everyone around them. They won battles they should have lost. They built institutions that lasted. They achieved things their contemporaries could not. The price was invisible for a long time. This is the deepest and most deliberate part of Sauron's engineering. The first effect of the ring is not corruption. It is not even the beginning of corruption in any visible sense. The first effect is simply that the ring works. It delivers on its promises. The bearer has more time, more capability, more authority. Months pass, then years. The ring is giving them what it promised. There is no obvious cost. The only peculiarity is that the ring feels increasingly necessary, not in the way of addiction, or not only that, but in the way of something that has become part of you. You would feel incomplete without it. But this seems like a reasonable consequence of using something that is genuinely useful. The hammer feels strange when you put it down, too. Years pass. Then decades. And somewhere in the passage of decades, something has changed that the bearer cannot quite see from inside, because the change has been happening so gradually that each increment is below the threshold of notice, the slow fading. Let me describe the process of becoming a ring wraith as precisely as Tolkien's text and letters allow, because the precision matters. This is not a dramatic moment. It is a long, slow change that looks different from inside than it looks from outside. From outside, the bearer begins to look unnatural. Not immediately monstrous, that comes much later, if it comes at all in any visible physical sense. Just unnatural. The aging process slows, and then effectively stops. The bearer, who was 40 when they received the ring, is still visibly 40 at 60, at 80, at 100. Their peers have aged and died and been replaced by younger people who look at this person and feel something wrong that they cannot articulate. Not old age on a human face, but something else. The specific quality of wrong that comes from a face that has stopped updating, that does not carry the marks of the years that have passed. This is already the beginning of the loss. The bearer is losing their place in the ordinary human world. The world where time passes and you change with it, and your body is the record of your experience. They are becoming, visibly, something other. Not something inhuman yet, but something that is no longer quite fully in the human story. From inside, the bearer is noticing changes in how they perceive the world. The physical world is becoming, not less real exactly, but less vivid. Not faded, not blurry, just slightly less present. Like a painting losing some of its saturation, not obviously at any given moment, but observable when you compare it to how things used to look. Colors are a little less sharp, textures a little less immediate. The sensory world that was once the whole world is becoming, gradually, a somewhat thinner version of itself. What is becoming more vivid is the other world, the shadow world, the realm of spirit that ordinary mortals barely perceive at all. The bearer is beginning to see things they did not used to see. The faint presences of spirits in places, the lingering traces of great events from the distant past, the subtle glow or shadow that attends beings of power. And among the things they can see more clearly, with a clarity that builds over years into an overwhelming luminosity, are the rings of power themselves. The ring they wear, which used to feel like a piece of jewelry they happened to be fond of, is beginning to feel like the most real thing in the world. The realest thing. The anchor of reality itself. Tolkien is specific about this. The ring does not replace the bearer's self all at once. It gradually displaces it. The bearer's own thoughts and desires and perceptions gradually become harder to distinguish from the ring's thoughts and desires and perceptions, not because the ring is simply overwriting them, but because the bearer's developing sensitivity to the ring's presence makes the ring's will feel increasingly like their own will. Their own desires begin to rhyme with the ring's desires. Their own perceptions are increasingly filtered through the ring's awareness. At some point, and this is different for different bearers, depending on the strength of the individual personality and the depth of the individual attachment to ordinary human life, the proportion flips. There used to be a self that was wearing a ring. Now there is a ring-influenced consciousness that occasionally remembers having been a self. This is not a single moment. This is a crossing that happens gradually and that the bearer cannot precisely identify even in retrospect, because the retrospect is already occurring from the ring-influenced consciousness. By the time you are far enough across that line to see the line, you are already too far across it to cross back. The shadow world and what it means to live there. Here is the specific physical and metaphysical reality that the Nazgûl inhabit, and why it is terrible in a very specific way. Tolkien's cosmology posits, essentially, two dimensions of the same world. There is the physical world, the world of matter and body and sensory experience, the world mortals primarily inhabit. And there is the spirit world, which Tolkien sometimes calls the unseen world, in which spiritual beings primarily exist, and which ordinary mortals barely perceive. These two worlds are not separate places. They are two ways of inhabiting the same place. Most beings inhabit primarily one or primarily the other, with the capacity for some perception of both. Mortals live in the physical world and have very limited perception of the spirit world. They might occasionally have dreams or premonitions, might occasionally sense presences that are not physically visible, but their primary experience is physical. Spirits like the Maya exist primarily in the spirit world, but can clothe themselves in physical form when they choose to interact with the physical world. The ringwraiths have been pushed, gradually and involuntarily, from one mode to the other. They started as physical beings with some ordinary mortal sensitivity to the spirit world. The ring extended them, stretched them, gradually shifted their mode of existence from the primarily physical to the primarily spiritual. By the time the process is complete, by the time they are fully wraiths, they exist primarily in the spirit world and have lost most of their physical presence. This means several things that have specific and terrible consequences for their experience. It means they experience the physical world as the diminished version. The world of matter is now the thin, secondary, hard-to-perceive realm for them, just as the spirit world was for their original mortal selves. The reversal is complete. They can still perceive the physical world, still interact with it in limited ways, but it is no longer their primary home. It means their primary sensory experience is now the spirit world, the world of wills and presences and powers, the world where the ring is an overwhelming beacon of reality, the world where Sauron's will presses everywhere like weather, the world where other rings shine with a visible light and ordinary mortals are barely present at all. This is a world that human psychology was not designed to inhabit. The psychological structures that give human experience its coherence, the distinction between self and world, the sense of individual perspective, the experience of time as something you are moving through, these structures are contingent on the specific way that mortal consciousness is. Embedded in a mortal body in a physical world. Remove the body, remove the physical world as the primary plane of experience, and these structures begin to dissolve. And it means that their experience of time is wrong. Utterly, hopelessly wrong. Mortals experience time through the rhythms of the body, hunger and sleep and the seasonal cycles that the body participates in, the aging that marks the years. Remove those rhythms and time becomes something else entirely. The Nazgûl, who are 3,000 years old, have had 3,000 years of the wrong kind of time. Time that does not have the human rhythms that give it its particular quality of being time rather than just duration. The Witch King end the particular darkness. The Witch King of Angmar deserves specific attention, because he is the endpoint of the process, the ringwraith who has been what he is the longest, who has developed in the specific direction his nature allowed, who is the fullest expression of what ring corruption produces in an exceptionally powerful original subject. He has been the Witch King for 3,000 years by the time of the Lord of the Rings. 3,000 years of being the Lord of the Nazgûl, Sauron's greatest servant, the instrument of his will in the physical world. 3,000 years of extending his presence like a shadow across everything he touches, of breaking the spirit of opposition wherever he finds it, of building and sustaining the specific aura of hopeless terror that Tolkien calls the Black Breath. What was he before? Tolkien tells us he was a great king of men, probably Menrayan, probably a figure of genuine greatness in his era. The Witch King's specific qualities as a ringwraith, his commanding presence, his military genius displayed across the 8th century campaign against Arna, his ability to inspire absolute loyalty in lesser servants while inspiring absolute terror in enemies, these are the characteristics of someone who was, in life, an extraordinary leader. The ring took what was there and made it darker and wider and more total. But it started with something real. 3,000 years of this. 3,000 years of being the instrument of a will that is not your own. of having your considerable capacities deployed in the service of purposes you did not choose, of being the most visible face of a darkness that is not quite you, but is not separate from you either. The Witch King is not Sauron. He has a distinct identity, distinct qualities, distinct capabilities, but his identity has been so thoroughly colonized by the ring and by Sauron's will that the distinction between his own purposes and Sauron's purposes has become practically academic. The prophecy that surrounds him, "No living man can hinder him," is interesting in this context. It is a true prophecy, not merely a boast. It reflects something specific about what the Witch King has become. A being whose existence is so thoroughly in the spirit world that the ordinary instruments of physical violence, the ordinary agency of ordinary mortals, cannot directly undo him. He is not invulnerable in the way a mountain is invulnerable. He is invulnerable in the way a shadow is invulnerable to swords. You cannot hurt a shadow by hitting it, not because it is hard, but because the category of hitting does not apply to what a shadow is. And then on the Pelennor fields, the specific exceptions to this invulnerability arrive. Owen, who is not a man, and Merry, carrying the barrow blade. The barrow blade is made for exactly this purpose, forged in the wars against the Witch King's own Angmar kingdom by Nadain smiths who knew what they were making it for. The blade breaks the specific enchantment that keeps the Witch King's presence coherent in the physical world. The enchantment that was the ring's gift of extended physical semi-existence. And Owen's sword drives home the point. What happens to the Witch King in that moment is not, exactly, death. It is dissolution. The particular form that had been sustained across 3,000 years by the ring's power and Sauron's will simply ceases to be coherent. The consciousness that was somewhere inside that form, whatever remained of the great king who accepted the ring 3,000 years before, if it still existed in any meaningful sense, it is gone now. Not to whatever afterlife men are promised in Tolkien's mythology. Just gone, the way a flame goes out rather than the way a fire dies down. What remains of a person? This is the question that haunts the Nazgûl's story, and it is the question Tolkien deliberately leaves partially unanswered. What remains of the original person inside the wraith? The answer depends on which stage of the process we are talking about. In the early centuries, the answer is most of them. The great king who accepted the ring in the late Second Age still exists, still has his memories and his relationships and his specific personality and his particular relationship to the things he cares about. The ring is working on him, is gradually shifting him toward the spirit world, is gradually displacing his will with its own, but he is still substantially himself. If you could talk to the Witch King in the 1st century of his ring bearing, you would be talking to a man. Changed, yes, increasingly wrong in ways he might not fully perceive, but a man. In the Middle Centuries, the long centuries between the ring's first corruption of the Nine and the ring's first apparent defeat at the end of the Second Age, and then the long Third Age, the answer is less clear. There is a self in there, but the self has been so thoroughly interpenetrated by the ring's influence that it is genuinely difficult to determine where the self ends and the ring's influence begins. The ring wraith thinks thoughts that are partially his own and partially the ring's. He wants things that are partially what he wanted, and partially what the ring wants. The proportion shifts across the centuries toward an ever smaller fraction of original self. By the Third Age, by the time we see the Nazgûl on the road to the Shire, the answer is the most terrible, almost nothing. There is consciousness in there. There is memory of what was. Tolkien suggests this, that the Nazgûl remember their original lives in the way of things seen from a very great distance. There is perhaps something that functions like a remnant of personality, the specific flavor of being a particular person rather than a generic consciousness. But the active agency, the capacity to act from one's own values and desires rather than from the ring's will, is essentially gone. The Nazgûl are conscious instruments. They experience their existence. They cannot choose otherwise than they do. This is, I think, the deepest horror Tolkien builds into the ringwraith concept. Not that they are powerful, Not that they are terrifying, not that they are relentless in pursuit of their purposes. The deepest horror is that somewhere in there is a person who is experiencing all of this, who has been experiencing it for centuries, who cannot stop. The Witch King knows what he is. The Nazgûl in general know what they are in some attenuated sense. They know they were not always this. They know at some level of deep consciousness that what is happening to them is wrong in a way that does not depend on their current values telling them so, because their current values have been colonized. The wrongness is registered at a level below their current capacity to evaluate it, somewhere deeper than choice or judgment. Somewhere in the part of consciousness that was there before the ring got to it, and that the ring cannot fully reach because there is nothing there to work with anymore. Only the bare registering of an existence that has gone wrong. Tolkien's theological framework is relevant here. In his mythology, the gift to men is mortality, the gift of death, which allows men to leave the world and go wherever Ilúvatar sends men, beyond the circles of the world. The elves are immortal within the world's life, bound to its history until it ends. Men are not bound this way. Their immortal souls are meant to go elsewhere. The rings extend men's existence beyond its designed term, keep them in the world past the point where they were meant to leave it. And this extension is not a gift, but a violation, a perversion of the very thing that makes mortal life meaningful. The Nazgûl are men who have been kept in the world past their time, past the point where their being in the world has any meaning, past the point where they are genuinely living rather than just continuing. They are, in the deepest theological sense Tolkien gives the word, unliving. Not dead. Death would be a gift to them. Not alive. Unliving. Maintained in a state that mimics existence without any of the content that makes existence what it is. The Black Breath AS experience. The Black Breath is what the Nazgûl broadcast, the specific quality of their existence that bleeds into the physical world and affects those around them. Most discussions of the Black Breath focus on its effect on others, the paralysis, the despair, the specific terror it produces. But the Black Breath is also, and primarily, the Nazgûl's own experience made contagious. What the Nazgûl experience, the specific quality of being what they are, is the experience of existence from which all the content that makes existence valuable has been drained, not the pain of deprivation. Because pain is itself a form of content, a form of being connected to the world in a way that generates information. What they experience is something closer to the total absence of the thing that makes experience matter. Not despair in the human sense, which is the feeling of loss, the feeling of caring about something and not having it. Something beyond despair, which no longer even has access to the caring. When the Nazgûl ride close, this is what they're broadcasting. Not their anger, not their malice, not their desire to destroy. These are motivations that still belong to the realm of having a self that wants things. What the Black Breath broadcasts is the quality of the Nazgûl's existence itself, which is existence stripped of the specific conditions that make it existence in any meaningful sense. And when this bleeds into the perception of ordinary mortals who are near them, what those mortals feel is the closest approximation of this experience that a consciousness embedded in a living body and a living world can have, the sudden, overwhelming conviction that nothing matters. That resistance is pointless, that hope is not merely unlikely but actually impossible, not as a judgment but as an immediate perception. This is why the Black Breath is so much worse than ordinary fear. Ordinary fear has an object. You are afraid of the ring wraith because it is dangerous and you might die. This is the ordinary fear, and ordinary fear is workable. It can be converted into action, into fight or flight, into the energy of self-preservation. The Black Breath is something different. It is not fear of what might happen. It is the sudden perception of the specific existential quality of the Nazgûl's own state, not as a description but as an experience. And the body's immediate response to that perception, which is collapse, not flight. Not fight. Collapse. The body goes limp. The mind goes blank. Not because something is attacking, but because the specific thing that makes resistance possible, the sense that you are a person in a world that has stakes, has been temporarily suspended by proximity to a being in whom that thing has been permanently suspended. The Athelas, the king's foil that Aragorn uses to heal those affected by the Black Breath, works precisely because it has the opposite property. It is strongly associated with the life of the world, with the specific quality of living things in contact with their proper environment. Its scent brings back the thing the Black Breath temporarily takes away. The immediate, sensory, particular connection to a world that is real and specific and worth being in. It is the antidote because it is the opposite. Not the experience of existence stripped of content, but the experience of existence in its most particular and vivid form. The 9 ASA Unity. There is something else about the Nazgûl that is rarely examined closely. The question of their relationship to each other and what it means that they operate as a group. The 9 rings for men were 9 separate instruments given to 9 separate individuals who were 9 separate personalities with 9 separate histories and 9 separate processes of corruption. They were not initially connected to each other, only connected each of them individually to the One Ring and through it to Sauron. In the early centuries of their ring bearing, they would have been 9 separate kings, wearing their rings independently, not particularly aware of each other except as political contemporaries. But as the ring corruption deepens across the centuries, something changes in how they relate to each other. Not a conscious decision to become a collective, not anything chosen, just the gradual consequence of all of them becoming, increasingly, extensions of the same will. Sauron's will, operating through all 9 rings, coordinates them in a way that gradually overrides their independence. By the time they are fully wraiths, they are something between 9 individuals and a single distributed entity. Not quite either, not quite both. The Witch King is their leader and always has been, reflecting that he was the greatest of them in life and is the most fully developed Nazgûl. But the nature of his leadership has changed across the centuries from anything that resembled the leadership of a king over independent subordinates to something more like the relationship of a hand to its fingers. He commands, but the commanding is more like coordination within a single system than authority over separate agents. This has specific tactical and existential implications. The 9 Nazgûl moving as a coherent group are more terrifying than 9 individual wraiths would be. Not simply because of numbers, but because of the quality of their unified presence. The combined weight of 9 existences stripped of content, projected together, creates something more oppressive than any individual Nazgûl can produce. The moment at the ford of Bruinen, where all 9 converge on Frodo simultaneously, is terrifying not simply as 9 versus 1, but as the full force of a single distributed will bearing down on a single point. What this means for the question of what remains of the individual persons is deeply complicated. The 9 ringwraiths, as they become more thoroughly extensions of a single will, become less distinguishable from each other except in specific ways. The Witch King has specific individual characteristics, his particular history, his particular military genius, the specific quality of his command presence. Carmel has specific individual characteristics, his night perception, his eastern origin, his particular style of darkness. The others have less individual distinctiveness in the text. They have become, in whatever reduced form, more fully absorbed into the collective instrument than the 2 most powerful. What this suggests is that the dissolution of individual selfhood in the wraith condition is not uniform across all 9. The stronger the original personality, the more of it persists in attenuated form, even through the centuries of ring corruption. The Witch King is the most clearly individualized Nazgûl because he was the most powerful original person. The nameless others are more fully absorbed because they were less resistant to the absorption. What they can and cannot do. The specific capabilities and limitations of the Nazgûl are not arbitrary. They follow directly from the metaphysical reality of what they are, and examining them carefully tells you a great deal about the specific nature of the wraith condition. They are invisible, except for their wrappings. This is not magic invisibility in the way the One Ring produces invisibility. It is the simple physical fact that they have no physical substance to see. The black cloaks and robes they wear are not worn over bodies in any meaningful sense. They are the physical markers of a presence that is otherwise entirely in the spirit world. When you see a Nazgûl, you are seeing the clothes which are present in the physical world, and you are perceiving the presence which is in the spirit world but has effects that bleed through. You are not seeing the Nazgûl itself, because the Nazgûl itself has nothing to see. They perceive primarily through the spirit world, which means they perceive rings and people with rings very clearly, and perceive ordinary mortals who are not connected to rings much less clearly. This is why Frodo becomes extraordinarily visible to the Nazgûl when he puts on the ring. He is suddenly present in their primary mode of perception, rather than in the secondary mode they use to dimly perceive ordinary physical beings. And it is why the Nazgûl on the road to the Shire can sense that something is near, but cannot precisely locate 3 ring-less hobbits hiding in tree roots. The hobbits are barely visible to the Nazgûl's primary senses, just enough of a presence to provoke searching without being clearly locatable. They have significant difficulty with fire and water. This follows directly from their spirit world existence. Both fire and water have strong associations in Tolkien's mythology with the physical world's vitality and with the specific powers that oppose darkness. Fire is not merely a physical phenomenon in Tolkien's cosmos. It is connected to the fundamental creative energy of the Ainur. Water, particularly running water, is associated with Olmo and with the life of the physical world. Both of these elements interact with the Nazgûl's spirit world existence in ways that are damaging, not because of any mystical anti-Nazgûl property of these elements per se, but because of what they represent in the deep structure of the world. They can be harmed by the right physical instruments under the right conditions. The Morgul blade is designed to work in the Nazgûl's primary mode of existence. It works on the spirit world level, its wound continuing to operate in the spiritual dimension even after the physical injury is addressed. Conversely, instruments specifically made to counter the Nazgûl, like the barrow blade that Merry uses, forged with specific enchantments by Nadain smiths who knew what they were making it for, can disrupt the Nazgûl's coherence in the physical world by attacking the specific enchantment that maintains their borderline physical presence. They cannot be killed in the ordinary way. This is the single most important practical consequence of their mode of existence. A sword strike to where a body would be, if there were a body, will damage the physical wrappings and disrupt the Nazgûl's physical manifestation temporarily. But you cannot kill something that isn't alive in the ordinary sense. What the Nazgûl fear is not death. They cannot die, but dissolution. The unmanning that Tolkien occasionally uses as a term for what happens when a spiritual entity loses the coherence of its form. For the Nazgûl, dissolution means the loss of even the attenuated form of existence the ring sustains, a return to nothing, or rather a continuation in the most minimal possible form, barely present anywhere, waiting in darkness. When Sauron falls at the end of the War of the Ring, the Nazgûl dissolve not because they are killed in any conventional sense, but because the power sustaining their existence, the One Ring and through it Sauron's will, is unmade. Without the ring, there is nothing to maintain them in even the attenuated form of existence they had. They cry out, and then they are gone. What they go to, Tolkien does not say. Whether the men who were originally inside them have any continuation, whether Ilúvatar's promise to mortal men somehow applies even to beings who have been so thoroughly distorted across 3,000 years, this is one of the questions the mythology deliberately leaves open. The Morgul blade end its terrible logic. The Morgul blade that the Witch King stabs Frodo with at Weathertop deserves specific attention, because it is one of the clearest windows into the Nazgûl's specific mode of operation and into what they are ultimately trying to do. The blade is not trying to kill Frodo. This is the crucial point that the narrative makes explicitly. The blade is designed to transform. A fragment of it breaks off inside the wound and begins to work its way toward Frodo's heart, not to damage his physical body. The wound itself is comparatively minor as physical injuries go, but to work on his spiritual reality. The fragment is moving toward the heart because the heart is the traditional seat of the self, and what the fragment is doing, if it reaches there, is transforming the self in the same direction that the ring's long exposure transforms a bearer. It is trying to make Frodo a wraith. Specifically, it is trying to short-circuit the long process of ring corruption that normally takes decades or centuries, using Morgul craft to do in weeks what the ring would accomplish over time. If the fragment reaches Frodo's heart and completes its work, Frodo becomes a wraith creature, not a ring wraith in the full sense. Because Frodo doesn't have one of the 9 rings, and Sauron's will doesn't directly fill and sustain him, but a wraith creature, drawn into the spirit world, controlled by the ring and therefore controllable by Sauron, and capable of being used as an instrument to bring the ring to its master. The genius and the horror of this strategy is that it uses the ring against itself. The ring on Frodo's finger, combined with the Morgul shard doing its work, would draw Frodo into the spirit world where the ring's master can claim him. The ring on the bearer's finger is normally the ring's protection. It can't be taken by force if the bearer is in the physical world with enough presence to resist. The Morgul shard is a workaround. Don't take the ring. Take the bearer into a state where the ring takes itself to its master. As Frodo fades across the journey to Rivendell, Tolkien shows us what this process looks like from the inside. The world becomes grey and indistinct. The ordinary physical world loses its color and presence and weight. The shadow world becomes more vivid. The ringwraiths, when Frodo encounters them, become more visible rather than less, because Frodo is moving toward their mode of existence, toward the plane on which they primarily perceive. And at the ford of Bruinen, close to the completion of the process, Frodo is already partially in their world. He can see them as they actually are, robed in white rather than in shadow black, terrible and bright in the spirit world. He sees what they are, and he sees what he is close to becoming. The elvish healing that Elrond performs at Rivendell is not simply physical medicine. It is a restoration of Frodo's full presence in the physical world, a pulling back from the partial spirit world existence the shard had been dragging him toward. The wound is permanent. The anniversary of Weathertop returns as a psychosomatic reality, a kind of PTSD of the spirit world. But the transformation is reversed. He remains in the physical world. What the Morgul Blade episode shows us is that the Nazgûl have developed, from their specific mode of existence, a specific capability. The ability to extend wraith-making beyond themselves, to project the wraith condition into beings who have not had centuries of ring corruption, but can be short. Circuited there by Morgul craft, they are not simply wraiths. They are a kind of wraith that makes wraiths, a condition that replicates itself, and this is the most powerful weapon in their arsenal, precisely because it does not require a direct confrontation where their vulnerabilities might be exposed. The question of what they still want. Here is a question that the text raises without fully answering. Do the Nazgûl still want anything for themselves? The answer, as far as Tolkien's text allows, is yes. But the want has been narrowed to almost nothing. They want the ring. Not because the ring was always what they wanted. In their original lives they wanted power, extended life, the preservation of their civilizations, the ability to accomplish great things. They wanted many things, the way any rich human life wants many things. But the ring's long process of colonization has narrowed their wanting to a single point: the ring, which represents all the power and life extension and capability they originally sought, in its most concentrated form. The ring is no longer a means to what they want. It is what they want. The original desires have been collapsed into their most abstract and extreme form. Beyond this, they have residual loyalties that are functionally indistinguishable from their original values, but that have been completely corrupted. The Witch King was probably loyal to something, a kingdom, a people, an idea of civilization before the ring made him loyal to Sauron. The loyalty is still there in the psychological architecture, but the object of the loyalty has been replaced. Whatever specific people or places or ideas the Witch King cared about in life, the ring has replaced these with Sauron, the ring's maker, the ring's purpose, the ring's destination. The emotional structure of loyalty is intact. The content has been completely overwritten. This is perhaps the most disturbing detail in the entire picture of what ring corruption does. It doesn't simply eliminate the original person's values and replace them with emptiness or with alien values. It takes the specific psychological structures, the capacity for loyalty, the capacity for dedication, the capacity for long-term commitment to something beyond oneself, and repurposes them for Sauron's ends while keeping the structure itself. The Nazgûl are genuinely loyal. They are genuinely committed. They genuinely serve with a dedication that exceeds what any merely paid or merely frightened servant could manage. And this genuine quality, this real thing that was real in them as human beings, is what has been turned against everything it should have served. What they tell us. The Nazgûl are not simply scary villains in black robes. They are Tolkien's most complete statement about the specific nature of a specific kind of evil. The evil that works through genuine good qualities, that takes real things and makes them serve wrong purposes. That produces not the absence of value, but its perversion. Each of the 9 was a great person. Their greatness was real. Their desire for the things the rings offered, more time, more capability, the ability to accomplish something lasting, these desires were not inherently corrupt. Great people have these desires. The desire to do more than a single human lifetime allows is a recognizably human response to the gap between what you can see needs doing and what you can do in the time you have. Sauron did not need to corrupt these desires. He needed only to offer a corrupted means of satisfying them, a means that would deliver something real in the short term and take everything in the long term. The genius of the ring as an instrument of evil is precisely that it works with the real. It does not have to manufacture desire or create longing from nothing. It finds what is there and offers it at a price that is invisible for long enough that the transaction is complete before the buyer can see the full bill. And the result is 9 beings who are the ghost of what they were, who have the shape of greatness without its substance, who have the structure of loyalty without its proper object, who have extended life without its meaning, who exist in the closest thing to pure suffering that Tolkien's mythology knows: consciousness without content, duration without life, the specific horror of a person trapped in a condition they cannot change and cannot truly be said to survive. This is why the Nazgûl are genuinely frightening in a way that goes beyond their tactical threat. They are not simply dangerous enemies. They are demonstrations of a specific kind of fate, a fate that presents itself as a gift, that works through your own best qualities, that requires no single moment of dramatic betrayal, and that leaves you something no one should ever become. They are what you get when you want the right things in the wrong way, for long enough. They are, in the end, a warning. Not to stop wanting. Not to stop caring about the things great people care about: civilization, legacy, the question of whether your time in the world meant anything, but to be very, very careful about who is offering to solve those wants, and at what price. The 9 men who accepted the rings were not fools. They were not obviously corrupted in the beginning. They were people who wanted things worth wanting, who were offered something that seemed to deliver those things, who said yes before they understood what yes meant. And on the road through the Shire at dusk, something that was once one of them pauses and lifts its shrouded head, and the birds go silent, and somewhere deep inside the thing that was a man, in a place the ring cannot fully reach because there is nothing there to reach anymore, something registers the specific quality of what it has become. And the birds are silent. The second age end the moment of the gift. To fully understand the tragedy of the 9, we need to go back to the specific historical moment when the rings were given. The late Second Age, perhaps around SA 1600 to 2000, when Sauron as Anatar was completing the ring-making project and deploying his gifts. The Second Age is the age that Tolkien himself said was underexplored in his finished work. The age of Menor at its height and its fall. The age of the last alliance and the first great defeat of Sauron. For the 9 men who received the rings, it was the age in which they were at the height of their own power. Picture what this world looked like. Númenor is still standing, or for the earliest recipients, Númenor is at the height of its power. A civilization of extraordinary accomplishment that has colonized the western coasts of Middle-earth with great harbor cities and impressive roads and the infrastructure of an empire. The descendants of Menor in Middle-earth are building what will eventually become Gondor and Arnor. There are kings and lords and military commanders and scholars who are operating at a level of achievement that will not be matched again in the history of men. The 9 men Sauron approached were almost certainly exactly these people. The greatest, the most ambitious, the most capable among the Inmemorian lords and their Middle-earth allies. Sauron, in his Anatar guise, had been moving among the elvish craftsmen of Eregion. He understood the specific culture of achievement and accomplishment that the great men of this era inhabited. He understood what they wanted and why they wanted it. The meeting, in each case, would have been different in its specifics, but similar in its structure. A figure of evident power and evident knowledge, Anatar presents differently to men than he did to the elves. Probably less as a craftsman's peer, and more as a figure of wisdom and ancient authority, since men do not have the elvish craft knowledge that would make a peer relationship credible. He offers the ring with the specific arguments that each recipient would find most compelling. He demonstrates, probably, that the ring works, lets them feel the extension of their perception, the amplification of their will, the specific quality of expanded capability that the ring genuinely delivers in its early phase. And each of the 9 accepts. For their own reasons. With their own specific desires in mind, some perhaps more cautious than others, some perhaps feeling a wrongness they cannot articulate, but overriding it, because the immediate reality of the ring's effectiveness is more present than the vague discomfort. And with the acceptance, the architecture snaps into place. The connection to the One is made. Sauron, somewhere in his tower, feels 9 new threads in the system. The 9 men put on their rings and felt what was promised. For a while, years, decades, maybe a century, what they felt was the gift. The time, the capability, the authority. They were the most powerful mortal men in the world. Their kingdoms prospered, their ambitions were achievable. The ring delivered, and in the background, at a level below their notice, the slow thinning had already begun. The long defeat from inside. Here is the version of the story that Tolkien never wrote, but that his mythology implies. The story of what it was like to be one of the 9, from the inside, across the full arc from accepting the ring to becoming fully a wraith. Not the Witch King specifically, he became the most powerful of them, and his story would be the story of greatest corruption. Let us imagine one of the lesser 9, a king of men, an Inmemorian lord of genuine ability, who accepted a ring in the late Second Age because he loved his kingdom and wanted more time to build it properly, and who spent 2,000 years becoming something no longer capable of recognizing what it had given up. Year 1 through 50, the ring works. He is more capable than he has ever been. His kingdom is more stable. His military campaigns succeed. His scholarship deepens. His enhanced perception lets him understand things he could previously only glimpse. He is aware, in a philosophical sense, that there may be a price to this, but the price is not visible, and the benefit is constant. He is grateful. He wears the ring always. Taking it off feels wrong, feels like losing a part of himself, and this feeling he interprets as the natural consequence of using something that has become genuinely useful. Nothing alarming. Year 50 through 200, he has stopped aging in any visible way. His peers have aged and died. He is surrounded by people who are 2 generations younger than his colleagues, and all of them find him slightly wrong. He knows this. He is also aware, at a level he does not fully examine, that the colors of the world are a little less vivid than they used to be. He dismisses this. He is an old man now, in years if not in appearance, and perhaps old men see the world this way. The ring is still working. He is still himself. He is still the same person who accepted the ring, with the same values, and the same loves, and the same understanding of what his life is for. Nothing fundamental has changed. Year 200 through 500, something has changed, but it is hard to name. He is less interested in things he used to love. The specific sensory pleasures, food, music, the look of a landscape at sunrise, these still register, but they register at a distance. The ring is more immediate, more real than these things. He is aware that there is something wrong with this perception, but cannot fully articulate it. He knows what he is doing, but increasingly cannot generate the motivation to do anything differently. The ring's desires rhyme with his own desires so closely that he cannot always tell which is which. Year 500 through 1000, he is functionally a wraith, though not fully. He wears the black robes and moves in shadows because the physical world is increasingly painful to his changed perception, too bright, too vivid, too present in ways that feel like an assault. The spirit world is more comfortable. He still remembers who he was. He still has the memory of the kingdom he built, the people he cared about, the specific desires that led him to accept the ring. These memories are preserved. The ring does not erase them, but they are preserved the way a museum preserves objects, behind glass, accessible, but not live. They do not generate feeling. They generate nothing but the ghost of a feeling. Year 1000 through 2000, he is one of the 9, fully. His individual name and history have been subsumed into the collective instrument. The ring's will and Sauron's will and his own will are, practically speaking, the same will. He does what he is sent to do. He goes where he is sent to go. Somewhere in the depths of his consciousness, there is still something that knows this is wrong. But this knowing cannot surface into the decision-making structure, because the decision-making structure has been completely colonized. The knowing is a prisoner in the basement of his own mind, unable to do anything with its knowledge. This is the full arc. Not dramatic, not a single fall. A very long, very slow diminishment, in which each step is small enough to accommodate, and the accumulation is only visible from outside, or from after. What Denethor saw, there is a scene in The Return of the King that illuminates the Nazgûl more than any direct description of them. Denethor's engagement with the Palantir, and what the Witch King has been doing through Sauron's use of the Minas Morgul stone. Denethor was using the Ithil stone to see clearly, to understand the truth of the situation, to not be deceived by false hope when accurate assessment of Mordor's power required acknowledging the scale of the threat. This is, in itself, not a corrupt desire. It is the specific desire of a great leader who takes his responsibility seriously. He will not pretend things are better than they are when the people of Gondor depend on his accurate assessment. Sauron, through the Minas Morgul stone, fed this desire by showing Denethor true things. Real things. The fleets of Umbar actually arriving. The armies of Mordor actually massing in numbers Gondor cannot match. The real and genuine hopelessness of a purely conventional military defense of Minas Tirith. None of this was false. All of this was true. And all of it was selected to produce a specific conclusion that served Sauron's purposes. The Witch King, as Sauron's primary instrument, had an interest in this process that went beyond simple strategic deception. The Witch King's specific capability, his ability to project the Black Breath, to broadcast the specific quality of his own existence into the minds of those he encounters, was operating through Sauron's use of the Palantir connection. Denethor, using the stone, was being exposed to the Witch King's presence at whatever attenuated level the stone allowed. Not the full Black Breath, which requires physical proximity, but something subtler and longer lasting. The specific quality of hopelessness that the Witch King embodies. Very quietly, very gradually, working into Denethor's already primed susceptibility to despair. This is why Denethor's madness has the specific character it has. Not the madness of someone who has lost their mind, but the madness of someone who has had the connection to hope surgically removed. He sees clearly. His assessments are not wrong exactly. He is not deluded about the military situation. He is, however, completely unable to factor in the possibility that things might go differently than his most pessimistic assessment would predict. He cannot access hope, because hope has been systematically undermined at the level of the spirit world, through the Witch King's influence across years of Palantir use. The Witch King's specific function in this context is the most sophisticated thing he does in the entire story. Not direct military confrontation, not the use of terror in the straightforward sense, but the long, patient, underground work of undermining the will to resist in the most capable. Defender of Gondor. In a way that the defender himself cannot detect, Denethor did not feel himself becoming hopeless. He felt himself becoming accurate. The corruption was indistinguishable from clarity, from inside. This is the Witch King as his 3,000 years of development have made him. Not simply a powerful fighter, not simply a projector of terror, but a being who has learned to use the specific quality of his existence, the quality of hopelessness, of existence without content, as a precision instrument. He has, in some terrible sense, mastered his own condition. He cannot change it. He cannot escape it. But he can deploy it with extraordinary sophistication against the minds of those who stand against his master. The moment on the Pelennor, redemption through destruction. I want to look very carefully at the Witch King's death on the Pelennor, because it is more philosophically significant than the straightforward victory it appears. The prophecy that no living man could hinder him is not simply a piece of dramatic irony that Tolkien set up to be subverted. It is a specific statement about the nature of the Witch King's existence, about what kind of harm can or cannot penetrate the specific mode of being that 3,000 years of ring corruption has produced. A living man, acting from his position as a living man embedded in the living world with a mortal body and mortal capacities, cannot harm a being that has been removed from the living world and the mortal body. The categories do not intersect in ways that allow the harm. Owen is not a man. This is not a technicality or a clever loophole. It is a genuine difference in the structure of her situation relative to the prophecy's constraint. The prophecy is describing a real limitation. Owen does not fit within that limitation in the relevant sense. She is a woman, which means her mode of being a mortal person in the world has specific qualities that are different from the qualities that make living men specifically unable to harm the Witch King. Merry's contribution is the Barrow Blade, which was forged specifically against the Witch King's power. This is also not a technicality. The blade was made to operate in the specific dimension where the Witch King's existence is located, forged with enchantments that target the spiritual architecture of what the Witch King is, not merely the physical wrapping. Without the blade, Owen's sword probably could not have done what it does. The blade breaks the specific enchantment that maintains the Witch King's coherence in the physical world. Owen's sword then presses through the gap. What happens to the Witch King in this moment is not death in any ordinary sense. His voice is described as rising, then wailing, then fading into a silence that feels too complete. What is happening is that the form that has been maintained across 3,000 years, the specific organization of Sauron's will and ring power, and whatever fragments of the original person remain, loses its coherence. The form dissolves. Whether what dissolves includes anything that was still the man inside, whether the great king of men who accepted the ring 3,000 years ago has any continued existence in whatever Tolkien's mythology promises the souls of men, this is not answered. Tolkien deliberately does not answer it. The dissolution happens. The form is gone. What was inside the form, if anything was still inside it, is unaccountable. There is something in this moment that is closer to mercy than to victory. Not for Owen or Merry, for whom it is straightforwardly a victory that saves the world, but for the Witch King, in whatever sense mercy can apply to something that has been what he is for 3,000 years. The end. Not more duration of the undying condition. Not more centuries of being the instrument of a will that colonized the original self so long ago that the original self is barely imaginable. Just the end of it. Whether this constitutes any kind of release for whatever remained of the person, Tolkien does not say. It might, The souls of men go beyond the world in Tolkien's theology, and even souls badly damaged by the ring might eventually find their proper destination. Or it might not. The damage might be too total, the original person too thoroughly consumed, for any continuation to be meaningful. The theology is silent. The silence is appropriate. What is not silent is the specific quality of the moment's aftermath. After the wailing and the fading, Tolkien describes what the observers see: an empty helm and empty hauberk, a pale king's mantle lying in a loose pile on the ground. No body, no blood, nothing that was ever a person. Just the wrappings, collapsed where they fell. This is the most honest depiction of what the Nazgûl actually are that Tolkien gives us anywhere. Not a fallen body. Wrappings without content. The form without the substance, fallen in a heap at the feet of the woman who did not fit the prophecy. 3,000 years of being a hollow thing, worn like clothing by a will that was never fully its own, and at the end, just the clothing. Lying in the grass of the Pelennor. The other 8, the less remembered. The Witch King gets most of the narrative attention, because he is the most individually developed of the 9. But the other 8 ringwraiths deserve a moment. Because their particular situation, less powerful, less individually characterized, more fully absorbed into the collective instrument, is in some ways more typical, and therefore more instructive. The 8 are nearly interchangeable in the narrative. They act as a group. They are called the Nazgûl as a collective. Even the one named character among them, Kamal, is given so little individual characterization that he is primarily notable for his specific Easterling origin and his night sensitivity, rather than for anything that reads as genuine personality. This near interchangeability is not a failure of characterization on Tolkien's part. It is part of the point. The 8 have been more fully absorbed into the collective instrument than the Witch King, whose individual strength has maintained a degree of distinctiveness even through 3,000 years. The 8 are the more complete expression of what ring corruption ultimately produces, not the preservation of an individual self in distorted form, but the dissolution of individual self into a larger purpose. If you want to understand what became of the specific persons these 8 were, the answer is, almost nothing remains. Not the Witch King's degree of individual capability, not his specific military genius, not his recognizable leadership presence. What remains is approximately the strength contribution they make to the collective, the specific perceptual capabilities their rings and their centuries of wraith existence have developed, and perhaps the faintest trace of what made them individually susceptible to the ring's approach in the first place, the specific shape of desire that Sauron targeted when he offered them the rings. These 9 great men, the Witch King and the 8, were the defining catastrophe of the Second Age in terms of what was lost. Not the fall of Menor, which was also catastrophic and also connected to Sauron's work, but 9 people who could have been what the best of Menor produced: wisdom, long life, genuine achievement, the building of things worth building, who instead became what Sauron needed them to be. 9 embodied demonstrations that the greatest gifts and the greatest achievements and the greatest ambitions of mortal humanity are, if approached in the wrong way, exactly the material from which the most terrible darkness can be built. The ring's end, and the Nazgûl's end. When Gollum falls into the fire of Orodruin on March 25 of TA 3019, the 9 ringwraiths are in the air over Mordor. They have been deployed to the skies on their winged beasts, present over the battlefield at the Black Gate, circling above the armies of Mordor and the desperate army of the West. This is where they are, when the world changes. The destruction of the One Ring does not reach them as news or as a distant sound. It reaches them the way the ring's original creation reached Celebrimbor through Nenya, immediately, through the system of connection that links all the rings, as a catastrophic collapse of the infrastructure on which their existence depends. The One Ring, destroyed, takes with it the power that sustained the 9 rings for mortal men. Not as a secondary consequence, but as a direct structural collapse, the One Ring to rule them all is gone. And what it ruled is therefore no longer ruled. The 9 rings, which were the basis of the Nazgûl's extended existence, fail simultaneously. The extended unlife that the 9 men had been living since the Second Age, the specific form of continued being that Sauron's architecture had maintained for 3,000 years, simply ceases to be maintained. What this looks like from outside is what the narrative describes. They cry out, they scream, and they are gone. The winged beasts probably survive. They are not ring constructs. They are creatures of the physical world who were tamed and commanded. But the riders are gone. The forms that were riding them simply cease to cohere and are gone. The specific quality of the destruction is worth sitting with. It is not like a physical death, where a body falls. There are no bodies to fall. There is no blood, no corpse, no specific physical event to mark the end. There is just the end of the form. The specific organization of ring power and Sauron's will and the remnant consciousness of 9 men simply loses its organizing principle and dissolves. The forms that had been projecting themselves into the physical world through their wrappings and their winged beasts and their terrible presence on the battlefield are suddenly not present. Tolkien does not describe the subjective experience of this for the Nazgûl, because there is no narrative perspective from which he could do so. We have only the external event. But the internal event, the experience from inside the wraith consciousness of the architecture that sustains you suddenly failing, this is one of the most fascinating and unanswerable questions the mythology poses. Is there a moment of clarity? A moment when whatever remains of the 9 men experiences the collapse of the ring's hold on them and recognizes what has happened? A moment when the thing that was a great king of men 3,000 years ago and has been an instrument of darkness for all those centuries registers the end? Tolkien does not say. The silence is perhaps the most honest possible response to the question. These 9 men were not saved in any conventional sense. They were ended. Whether the ending was the prelude to anything else, whether the souls of men, even souls as damaged as these, have the continuation that Tolkien's theology allows, is beyond what the mythology can tell us. What it can tell us is this: they were ended. After 3,000 years of the wraith condition, after centuries of the undying unlife that the ring sustained, they were ended. Whether this constitutes mercy or oblivion or something else entirely, the ending was real. The form that had been the Witch King fell as empty gear and was gone. The 8 others dissolved in the air over Mordor. And 3,000 years of Sauron's greatest and most terrible achievement simply ceased to be. The 9 men who accepted the rings are, at the end of the story, beyond any possibility of further consideration. Their story is over. What it was, and what it means, remains. What they leave behind. The Nazgûl are gone, but what they represent, the specific lesson their existence embodies, persists in the mythology and in the reader. Tolkien builds the Rings of Power as an object lesson in the specific nature of a specific kind of evil, the evil that works through genuine good qualities, that takes real desires and real capacities and real achievements and uses them as the material of corruption. The 9 ringwraiths are the fullest expression of this lesson, because they are the cases where the corruption ran to its logical endpoint, where the process that begins with a genuine person wanting genuine things ran to completion over 3,000 years and arrived at the hollow form on the Pelennor. Empty clothing in the grass. They are a warning that Tolkien does not present as a warning in the sense of a cautionary tale. He does not have a character turn to the reader and say, "And that is why you must not accept gifts from Dark Lords." The lesson is built into the structure of the story itself, into what the Nazgûl are and how they came to be that way, into the specific quality of their existence that Tolkien renders so carefully: the black breath, the invisibility, the wraith-like condition, the prophecy and its specific form. Of fulfillment. The warning is this: the thing that destroys you may be a real answer to a real need. The rings delivered what was promised. Extended life is genuinely good. Enhanced capability is genuinely good. The desire to do more than one lifetime allows is genuine and human, and not inherently corrupt. What corrupted the nine was not their desires but their failure to understand the architecture within which the satisfaction of those desires was being embedded. The specific condition that the satisfaction carried, which was the gradual transfer of their existence into Sauron's framework. Tolkien's point is not that wanting great things is dangerous. His point is that what matters, always and entirely, is the source of the means by which great things are sought. The nine men got what they wanted. What they got it from, the architecture within which it was delivered, the will that sat at the center of that architecture. This is what destroyed them. Slowly, invisibly, over centuries. They were not fools. They were not obviously corrupt. They were people who wanted the right things and accepted a wrong answer to those wants. And the wrongness of the answer was not visible until it was too late. This is Tolkien's specific and considered account of how the best people become the worst things. Not through a single dramatic choice. Not through obvious wickedness. Through a gradual process of being used by something that understood them better than they understood themselves, until there was nothing left to use. The 9 men and 9 kings, and 9 great lords of the Second Age. The 9 shapes on dark horses searching the Shire. The 9 forms dissolving in the air over Mordor. All the same 9. The same people. Changed beyond recognition, changed beyond recovery, changed beyond the possibility of their own agency, and yet, in whatever geological trace remains of the original persons, the same 9. That is what the Nazgûl became. And that is how they lost their humanity. Not all at once. Not through any single act of betrayal or surrender. Just slowly, year by year, ring by ring year, across the longest and most complete defeat that 9 great human lives could possibly suffer. The birds went silent on the road through the Shire. And on that road, in the shape that paused to smell the air, there was still, barely, a trace of the man who had once thought that more time was all he needed. He had all the time in the world. And it was the thing that destroyed him. The Nazgûl and the nature of prolonged evil. Here is something that most analyses of the Nazgûl miss entirely, and I think it is one of the most important things Tolkien is doing with them. The specific relationship between their 3,000-year duration and the specific character of the evil they embody. Most of Tolkien's villains exist on a timescale that is comprehensible to ordinary experience. A battle lasts a day. A siege lasts months. A war lasts years. Even Sauron's great campaigns play out on timescales of centuries, but they are presented as a series of events with identifiable beginnings and ends, escalations and defeats. The Nazgûl are different. They are not presented as participants in events primarily. They are presented as a condition, a state of the world that has been ongoing for so long that it is simply part of the landscape. When Gandalf talks about the Nazgûl in the canonical story, he does not say they are new or recent. He speaks of them as ancient, as a given, as something that has been part of the structure of the world's darkness for as long as anyone alive can remember. This is important because it does something specific to how the reader understands the nature of the threat. Most threats in fiction are events. Things that are happening, things that could potentially not happen, things that arrived and will eventually end. The Nazgûl are presented as a feature, something that simply is, that has been, that is not going anywhere. The road is dark, and there are things on the road, and there have been things on the road since before your grandfather's grandfather's grandfather was born. This is how genuinely long-term evil actually works in the world as Tolkien understood it. Not as dramatic events, but as persistent conditions. Not as things that happen to you, but as the world you inhabit. The Nazgûl on the roads of the Third Age are not an emergency. They are the background against which everything else occurs. They are the assumption of danger, the permanent condition of the world having gone wrong in a specific way a very long time ago. So long ago that nothing alive can remember the world being different. The specific horror of this is not the individual threat any Nazgûl poses, though that is real. The specific horror is the duration. The sense that the wrongness they embody has been part of the world for so long that it has become, in some terrible sense, natural. that the birds going silent when they approach is a fact of the world the way the weather is a fact of the world, unremarkable in its reliability. That generations of people have been born into a world where there are ring wraiths, have lived in a world where there are ring wraiths, have died in a world where there are ring wraiths, without the wrongness of this ever being addressed. This is Tolkien's understanding of how inherited evil works, how the consequences of terrible choices made thousands of years ago can become simply the conditions of ordinary life for people who had nothing to do with those choices, and who cannot even fully understand what the world was like. Before them, the 9 men who accepted the rings 3,000 years ago have, through their acceptance, contributed to a world in which the terror they became is simply the way things are for the millions of people who live in the Third Age. They are not just personally ruined. They ruined the world in a small but real way by becoming the specific kind of darkness they became. They extended the domain of fear and hopelessness across 3,000 years of human history. Not through any malicious new choice made in that period, but simply by continuing to be what they had become. Their existence is itself, by this point, a harm. Not because they are making choices, but because they are. The Wraith world and what Frodo sees. Frodo's experience as a partial wraith, as someone being drawn toward the spirit world by the Morgul blade, between Weathertop and Rivendell, is one of the most careful and most revelatory pieces of writing in all of The Lord of the Rings. It gives us, from the inside, the clearest possible picture of what the Nazgûl actually experience. As Frodo fades, the physical world becomes grey and indistinct. Not gone, he can still perceive it, still move through it, still interact with his companions. But it has the quality of something seen through gauze, something present, but not fully present. Not quite real in the way it was before. The vivid colors of Middle-earth, the green of the landscape, the blue of the sky, the warmth of firelight, these are still perceivable, but they do not land the way they used to. They are like descriptions of color, rather than the experience of color itself. What becomes more vivid as the physical world fades is the spirit world. And Tolkien describes what Frodo sees there with extraordinary care. He sees the trees of the forest as they truly are, great presences, old and knowing, vast extensions of vegetable being that the ordinary physical perception only glimpses. He sees other presences, ancient and formless, that have no physical manifestation at all. And he sees the ringwraiths. He sees them as they actually are. Not black shadows on black horses. Not the absence of form that is how they appear to ordinary perception. He sees them in the spirit world, and in the spirit world they are robed in white, pale, ghostly, terribly bright. Their faces, which are invisible to ordinary perception, are visible there. Their specific qualities, their individual presences as particular entities in the spirit world, are perceptible. This is one of the most important details in the entire text. In the spirit world, they are vivid, they are present. They have more reality there than they have in the physical world. And this vividness is not a comfortable vividness. It is the vividness of something that has been stripped of everything except its existence as a spiritual entity. The vividness of a presence with nothing warm in it. Nothing connected to the world of growing things and weather and the ordinary comforts of being alive. They are completely real in the spirit world. And being completely real there means being completely absent from everything else. The specific quality of being a ringwraith, seen from the dimension in which ringwraiths fully exist, is entirely and only what you are. Nothing else. No residue of human warmth or human connection or human particularness. Just the enormous, bare presence of a consciousness that has outlasted everything it should have retained. Frodo can see this. He can see what they are, seen correctly. And what he sees is more terrifying than the Black Horsemen of ordinary perception. Because the Black Horsemen at least have the dignity of mystery. What the spirit world shows him is the specific and complete reality of what they have become. The specific quality of 3,000-year-old emptiness made vivid. And somewhere in this vision, between the terror and the fading, Frodo probably understands something about what would happen to him if the process completes. He would not simply die. he would become this. This is what the Morgul blade was leading toward, not the end of Frodo, but the specific continuation of him that looks like this, from the inside of the spirit world. The Grey Havens saved him from this. Elrond's healing pushed him back out of the spirit world's grip. But he would carry the scar of the vision, the specific knowledge of what was almost his fate, for the rest of his life. And perhaps this is why, in the end, he goes west with the ring bearers, not simply because the wound of Weathertop never fully heals, but because he has seen, more clearly than anyone who has not been a partial wraith, what the alternative to dying properly looks like. And dying properly, going to the Undying Lands and whatever comes after that, looks like the better option. The Nazgûl, perceived correctly, made Frodo understand something important about death. About why mortality, despite its being a loss and a limit, is also genuinely a gift. You leave the world. You don't have to stay as what they stayed as. The Nazgûl and the question of pity. There is one more thing to address about the Nazgûl, and it is the question that follows naturally from everything we have discussed. Do they deserve pity? Tolkien does not ask this question directly in the text. He is too careful a writer to put it so boldly. But the structure of the Nazgûl's story raises it inevitably for any reader who has followed the argument about what they were before and what they became and how the process worked. They were great people. They wanted things worth wanting. They were deceived in a sense by an intelligence that understood their vulnerabilities better than they did. The corruption was so gradual that no single step required an obviously terrible choice, and the result was something that they presumably would not have chosen if they had seen clearly what they were choosing. Does this deserve pity? Tolkien's answer, embedded in the structure of the story, seems to be yes. But yes, in the sense that the tragedy of the Nine is a genuine tragedy. Not the tragedy of obviously bad people getting what they deserved, but the tragedy of people who got something much worse than what they deserved through a combination of their own choices and Sauron's manipulation. There is real loss here, real waste, real catastrophe of human potential. The greatness that the Nine represented, what they could have been and were not allowed to become, is a genuine absence from the world that matters. But the 3,000 years that followed their acceptance of the rings were 3,000 years in which they were instruments of immense harm. The 9 ringwraiths broke kingdoms, spread terror, destroyed lives on a scale that no individual human evil ever approaches. Whatever sympathetic account we give of how they became what they are, what they were cannot be considered only through the lens of their victimhood. They were also, for 3,000 years, perpetrators. Not freely choosing perpetrators in the way that requires full moral accountability, but not simply passive either. They were the active instrument of centuries of harm. Tolkien does not resolve this tension, because it does not resolve. The Nazgûl are simultaneously the greatest victims in the mythology, beings who had their humanity stripped from them across 3 millennia, and the greatest instruments of harm in the Third Age. Both are true, neither cancels the other. What Tolkien does suggest through the structure of the story is that pity is not the wrong response, but that pity must be informed by accurate understanding of what is being pitied. Frodo's pity for Gollum is the paradigmatic example. Pity that knows exactly how terrible the object of its pity is, and extends itself anyway. Not from naivety, but from a genuine understanding of how the terribleness came to be. Gollum was a murderer and a thief and a betrayer and a wretch. He was also the victim of something that destroyed him so thoroughly that any other outcome would have required a miracle. The 9 were great kings and great lords, who became the worst servants of the worst will in the history of the world. They were also the victims of that worst will, their greatness the very material from which their destruction was crafted. Both. Not one. Both. Pity is appropriate. It does not change what needs to be done. It does not suggest they should be spared the consequences of what they have become. It simply insists on the full picture, not the convenient picture that lets us be comfortable with the outcome, but the full and uncomfortable picture that holds both their tragedy and their harmfulness in the same frame. This is the most Tolkien thing about the Nazgûl, in the end. The story refuses comfort. It insists that you look at what they are and what they were simultaneously, that you hold the tragedy and the necessity together, without letting either one erase the other. They were great men. They became terrible things. Both of these are true, and the truth requires that you see the horses go still on the road at dusk, feel the birds fall silent, know the cold that is coming, and also know what is inside it, what was lost to make this thing, the specific and terrible cost of 3,000 years of the wrong kind of existence. That is what the Nazgûl became. That is how they lost their humanity. All of it, slowly, over the longest time.